In the 1950s, America was not a quiet place. It was a country vibrating with noise, desire, and expectation, a nation coming out of war and running headfirst into fantasy. And in that noise, two figures rose higher than anyone else, not as people, but as symbols carved into the national imagination. Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, names spoken with hunger, written with obsession, and consumed without mercy. This was an era when fame was not yet understood, only chased, and America did not know how to love its idols gently. It only knew how to demand more of them, more smiles, more performances, more illusion, until the human underneath disappeared. Elvis arrived like a shockwave, a southern boy with a voice that sounded older than his years and a body that moved in ways polite society pretended not to see. He was not rebellion by choice. He was rebellion by existence. Every television appearance a small cultural earthquake. Every song a reminder that something had shifted and could not be pushed back. Marilyn arrived differently but with equal force. Not loud, but blinding. A glow that cameras adored and audiences believed they owned. Her image carefully crafted yet permanently unstable. A woman turned into an idea long before she was allowed to understand herself. They ruled different kingdoms. Elvis the sound, Marilyn the sight. Yet both fed the same hunger. A public desperate for escape, longing to believe that beauty and talent could save them from their own ordinary lives. The world assumed that such forces must eventually collide, that attraction was inevitable, that history demanded it. But history does not always move toward noise. Sometimes it protects itself with silence. Hollywood in those years was a factory of dreams and a slaughterhouse of souls. Contracts written like cages, handlers disguised as guardians. And behind every smiling photograph stood a system built on control, fear, and profit. Elvis was managed, monitored, shaped into something safe enough to sell yet dangerous enough to excite. His rawness trimmed just enough to keep the machine running. His personal life locked away behind polite answers and nervous laughter. Marilyn was packaged as innocence and desire at the same time. A contradiction she was expected to live inside without breaking. Praised for her body, mocked for her mind, punished whenever she tried to claim seriousness. In a world that preferred her silent and smiling, they were surrounded constantly yet profoundly alone. Rooms full of people who spoke to them without hearing them, who touched them without understanding them, who praised them without knowing them. In such isolation, closeness becomes dangerous, not comforting, and the idea of truly meeting someone who could see through the illusion feels less like romance and more like exposure. Elvis understood control because it had been imposed on him early. He learned to be careful with his heart, the way he was careful with his words. Polite, respectful, guarded, carrying a deep fear of emotional chaos that he rarely named. Marilyn understood abandonment because it had followed her through every phase of her life. Childhood, relationships, studios, marriages. She was always almost chosen, almost protected, almost loved, and that almost hollowed her out more than rejection ever could. When people imagine why Elvis and Marilyn never crossed the line, they imagine schedules, missed opportunities, chance encounters that never quite happened. But the truth sits deeper than logistics. It lives in psychology, in survival instinct, in the unspoken recognition of danger. To meet someone who reflects your own fracture back at you requires strength. Neither of them truly possessed at that time. Not because they were weak, but because they were already carrying too much. America wanted them invincible, but invincibility is a lonely costume, and once worn long enough it fuses to the skin. Elvis was expected to be respectful, controlled, steady, a king who never lost his balance. Marilyn was expected to be available, soft, eternally desirable, a fantasy who never aged, never demanded, never broke. Together they would have challenged those expectations. Not as lovers, but as mirrors. And mirrors are dangerous in a business built on illusion. The industry whispered about them, speculated, teased the idea of something more, because mystery sells. But it never truly allowed space for authenticity, because authenticity disrupts control. They existed in overlapping circles. Their names mentioned in the same conversations, their photographs pinned on the same walls, their records and films consumed by the same generation, yet they remained separated by something stronger than distance. A mutual unspoken understanding that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Fame had already taken so much from them. Privacy, safety, trust, and crossing that line might have taken the last thing they had left, the fragile balance that kept them standing. The world sees silence as absence, but silence can be a decision, a form of self-preservation, a boundary drawn not in defiance but in fear. Elvis did not run toward emotional chaos. He stepped away from it quietly. Marilyn ran toward connection even when it hurt her, and those opposite movements meant that even if they had stood face to face, the moment might have collapsed under its own weight. This was not a love story that failed to happen. It was a collision carefully avoided, not by managers alone, not by timing alone, but by two souls who sensed that together, they might burn faster than they already were. In a decade obsessed with excess, restraint became invisible, and yet restraint shaped this story more than passion ever could. The world worshipped them loudly, endlessly, without pause, but between Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe there was no noise, only a quiet, unbroken line. And that silence, misunderstood by history, was not emptiness, it was survival. And this is where their story truly begins. Elvis. Presley did not grow up dreaming of becoming untouchable. He grew up learning how easily things could be taken away, how love could disappear without warning, how stability was something other families had, not his. Long before the screaming crowds, before the gold records and the controlled smiles, there was a thin boy in Tupelo, Mississippi, watching his world shrink and expand without his consent. Poverty was not a concept to him. It was texture. It was the feel of worn shoes, the sound of quiet arguments, the constant awareness that nothing was guaranteed. His twin brother Jesse was born dead, and although Elvis never knew him in life, that absence lived in the house like a shadow that never moved, a silent reminder that loss could arrive before you even understood what you were losing. His mother Gladys became his emotional center, not simply a parent but a refuge, the one place where affection felt unconditional and safe. That bond shaped him deeply, but it also taught him something dangerous, that love could become fragile if held too tightly. When fame arrived, it did not erase that lesson, it magnified it. Elvis was suddenly everywhere, but internally he remained cautious, measured, afraid of emotional freefall. He trusted slowly, if at all, and when he did, it was with a sense of quiet control, as if every emotional step had to be tested before weight could be placed on it. The world mistook his politeness for confidence, his calm demeanor for certainty. But underneath was a young man, constantly negotiating between desire and restraint. His managers and handlers reinforced this instinct, turning caution into policy, distance into discipline, warning him that emotional entanglements were liabilities, that love was unpredictable, that vulnerability was dangerous in an industry that thrived on exploitation. Elvis learned quickly that being open invited loss, so he learned to compartmentalize, to separate admiration from intimacy, affection from surrender. Women adored him, but adoration did not require exposure. It could be received at a distance. Controlled, filtered, ended when necessary. Emotional closeness was another matter entirely. It asked questions he was not prepared to answer, demanded honesty he was not trained to give, threatened the fragile balance he maintained between who he was and who he was required to be. Fame did not liberate Elvis. It refined his fear, gave it structure, purpose, and justification. Every decision was framed as responsibility, every hesitation as maturity, but often it was simply self-protection wearing a respectable mask. He watched what fame did to people who lost control, who trusted too easily, who let the public too far inside, and he learned to step back before the edge arrived. This was not cowardice, it was survival. In relationships, Elvis preferred clarity over chaos, loyalty over intensity, predictability over passion. He could handle devotion, but not emotional volatility, because volatility reminded him of how quickly things could fall apart. Marilyn Monroe presented many things to the world, but to Elvis, even from a distance, she represented something else entirely. Emotional exposure without armor. He saw, or at least sensed, the instability beneath her image, the longing, the need, the way the world consumed her and left her unprotected. That kind of emotional openness was dangerous to someone like Elvis. Not because it lacked appeal, but because it demanded reciprocity. Marilyn did not simply want to be admired. She wanted to be understood, held, chosen, and Elvis was not prepared to offer that level of emotional availability to anyone who could threaten his internal equilibrium. His loyalty ran deep, but it ran carefully and once committed. He expected structure, respect, and boundaries that protected both parties from collapse. Marilyn lived without those boundaries. Or perhaps more accurately, she was never allowed to build them. The idea of stepping into her emotional world would have required Elvis to dismantle his own defenses, to risk the kind of loss he had spent his life avoiding. Even his music, filled with longing and desire, was controlled, expressed through performance rather than confession. through rhythm rather than revelation. He gave the public intensity without intimacy, passion without exposure, and they never noticed the difference. Behind closed doors, Elvis was private, reserved, often withdrawn, seeking comfort in routines and familiar spaces rather than emotional exploration. He did not chase chaos. He fled from it, quietly and without drama. This is why the idea of Elvis and Marilyn meeting carries so much imagined heat. Because people assume attraction overrides instinct, but instinct often wins when survival is involved. Elvis instinctively avoided situations that threatened emotional destabilization, and Marilyn was surrounded by destabilization, not by choice but by circumstance. To step toward her would have meant stepping away from control, from safety, from the carefully maintained distance that kept him functional. It is easy to romanticize what never happened, to imagine a connection that could have healed them both. But healing requires readiness, and Elvis was not ready to be undone. He carried responsibility heavily, not only for himself, but for everyone who depended on him. An emotional collapse was not an option he believed he could afford. In a world that demanded constant output, constant presence, constant performance, he chose restraint over risk, silence over exposure, distance over desire. This was not indifference. It was fear shaped by experience, reinforced by power, and disguised as discipline. Elvis Presley did not avoid Marilyn Monroe because he felt nothing. He avoided her because he felt too much potential for disruption, and disruption was the one thing his carefully constructed inner world could not survive. By the time their paths could have truly crossed, his defenses were already permanent, his boundaries already rigid, and the boy who had learned too early how fragile love could be had no intention of testing fate again. And so, without words, without conflict, without scandal, Elvis stepped back, and in that step backward, the silence between two icons grew deeper, heavier, and more meaningful than any public romance ever could. Marilyn Monroe was not born believing she would be loved. She was born learning how easily love could disappear, how quickly promises dissolved, how silence could be louder than cruelty. And that lesson shaped every version of her that the world would later consume. Long before the cameras, before the platinum hair and carefully rehearsed smiles, there was Norma Jean, a child passed from one home to another, never staying long enough to believe she belonged, always adapting, always watching, always learning how to be wanted without being protected. Instability was not a phase in her life, it was the foundation. And from that foundation grew a hunger that never fully left her, the need not just to be seen, but to be chosen and kept. When Hollywood discovered her, it did not rescue her from that hunger. It weaponized it, turning her longing into a product, her vulnerability into a marketable glow, her confusion into charm. Marilyn was taught that desire was her value, that attention was her currency, and that being loved meant being admired, even if admiration came without safety. Men wanted her, studios controlled her, audiences consumed her, but very few people ever asked what she needed when the lights went off. She learned quickly that emotional honesty made people uncomfortable, that strength threatened the fantasy, that intelligence disrupted the image, and so she learned to fragment herself, to offer only the pieces that were rewarded and hide the rest where no one would look. But hidden pain does not disappear, it accumulates, it waits, it demands release. Marilyn wanted connection with an urgency that frightened the people around her, because connection required responsibility, and responsibility was inconvenient in a system built on exploitation. She fell in love quickly, not because she was reckless, but because she was hopeful, because she believed each time that maybe this would be the moment she would finally be anchored, finally held without conditions. Each disappointment carved that hope thinner, but it never fully died. Fame intensified her need rather than soothing it, because fame amplified distance, replaced intimacy with spectacle, substituted presence with applause. She was never alone, yet always unattended. Elvis Presley existed in her awareness not just as a man, but as a symbol of something she believed might understand her without devouring her. Someone famous enough to know the cost, yet grounded enough to offer stability. From a distance, Elvis represented restraint, control, a calm strength that contrasted sharply with the chaos that surrounded her daily life. Where others approached her with hunger, he appeared reserved, respectful, almost gentle in comparison. And that difference mattered to someone who had spent her life being consumed. But Marilyn did not know how to approach stability gently, because stability had never approached her gently. Her emotional world was intense, immediate, unfiltered, shaped by years of unmet needs and delayed safety. She did not want admiration at a distance. She wanted closeness, reassurance, proof that she was not disposable once the performance ended. This intensity made people cautious, even those who felt drawn to her, because it asked for something real, something costly, something that could not be controlled. Marilyn's relationships followed a familiar pattern. Initial fascination followed by misunderstanding, followed by withdrawal, each ending reinforcing the belief that she was too much, too fragile, too demanding, when in truth she was simply asking for what she had never received. The world mistook her need for weakness, her sensitivity for instability, without recognizing that sensitivity was how she survived, how she read rooms, how she sensed shifts before they became abandonment. She was not naive, she was hyper-aware, constantly scanning for signs that love was about to leave. In such a state, silence was unbearable. Distance felt like rejection, and restraint looked like indifference. Elvis's guarded nature, though rooted in self-preservation, would have registered to Marilyn as emotional absence, a familiar warning that attachment might not be returned with the intensity she required. Even if they had met, even if attraction had sparked, the rhythm of their emotional needs moved in opposite directions. Marilyn moved toward closeness when she felt threatened. Elvis moved away. Marilyn sought reassurance through connection. Elvis sought safety through control. These differences were not flaws. They were survival strategies formed by very different wounds, but survival strategies do not always coexist peacefully. Marilyn lived emotionally exposed, often without armor, hoping that vulnerability would invite care. But vulnerability without reciprocity deepens pain rather than heals it. Her longing to be held was not just physical, it was existential. A need to be anchored in someone else's certainty. To rest inside boundaries she did not know how to build herself. Elvis, despite his kindness, was not built to be that anchor. Not because he lacked compassion, but because he feared being pulled under by emotional intensity he could not manage. Marilyn sensed distance acutely, and distance activated her deepest fears. Fears of being left, replaced, forgotten. The idea of being close to someone who might step back emotionally would have reopened wounds she barely kept sealed. This is why the imagined romance between Marilyn and Elvis is so often misunderstood, framed as a missed passion rather than an avoided collision. For Marilyn, crossing that line would have meant risking everything she hoped to find: stability, safety, reassurance, on someone whose instincts leaned toward restraint rather than emotional immersion. Her world was already collapsing under unmet needs, failed promises, and the relentless pressure to perform happiness she did not feel. Another emotional fracture might have accelerated that collapse. Marilyn Monroe did not avoid Elvis because she lacked desire. She avoided him because desire without safety had already destroyed too much of her life. Whether consciously or instinctively, she understood that being near him might deepen her longing without fulfilling it, intensify her need without securing it. In a life defined by almosts and maybes, she could not afford another connection that required her to shrink or wait or wonder. And so, like Elvis, she remained on her side of the line, not out of disinterest, but out of exhaustion, an exhaustion born from years of reaching outward and finding nothing solid enough to hold her in return. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with understanding neither of them ever spoke aloud, a recognition that sometimes two broken people cannot fix each other. They can only avoid breaking faster. Marilyn's tragedy was not that she was too fragile for love. It was that love rarely arrived in a form that could meet her where she stood. And in that truth, the silence between two icons became not a failure, but a quiet act of self-preservation, one of the few she ever managed to hold on to. In Hollywood, distance is rarely accidental, yet coincidence often disguises intention. And in the case of Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, the moments where their paths nearly crossed were numerous, enough to invite suspicion. They moved through the same decade, the same cities, the same social gravity wells, surrounded by the same whispers and the same watchers, and still the line between them held. It was not because opportunity was absent, but because proximity does not guarantee convergence when forces are quietly working to keep two orbits apart. Los Angeles in the late 1950s was a city built on overlap, studios stacked beside nightclubs, private parties bleeding into public appearances, and Vegas acting as a pressure valve where fame exhaled after dark. Elvis recorded, performed, and disappeared into guarded spaces designed to minimize unpredictability. Marilyn attended premieres, charity events, and carefully curated gatherings, where her presence was both the attraction and the risk. They were spoken about in the same rooms, admired by the same executives, and yet the choreography of their lives rarely allowed unscripted contact. When Elvis was in town, Marilyn was often working, filming or recovering when Marilyn surfaced socially. Elvis was insulated by schedules and handlers who understood the value of distance. People assumed that such separation required dramatic intervention, but often it required only quiet consistency. A phone call not made, an invitation delayed, a suggestion redirected, a door closed politely before curiosity could turn into complication. Hollywood did not fear scandal. It feared loss of control, and the idea of two icons forming an unscripted connection represented a variable the system could not manage. Elvis's circle was particularly sensitive to this risk, aware that emotional entanglement could disrupt discipline, routines, and the carefully maintained image of respectability that protected his career. Marilyn's circle, though different in tone, shared a similar concern, fearing that any relationship not tightly framed by contracts and optics could expose her fragility to a world that would not respond with kindness. Near misses often happened in public spaces where their presence overlapped in rumor rather than reality. Award ceremonies where timing never aligned, parties where one arrived as the other left, hotels where they stayed on different floors, studios where schedules shifted just enough to prevent unplanned encounters. These were not accidents in the purest sense, but they were not conspiracies either. They were the natural outcome of systems designed to minimize risk by managing access. Both Elvis and Marilyn sensed this management, even if they did not fully understand its scope. They felt the invisible hands guiding their movements, shaping their availability, deciding who was safe to approach and who was not. Over time, that guidance becomes internalized, turning into instinct rather than instruction. You stop asking why something does not happen and begin assuming it simply cannot. For Elvis, near misses reinforced the belief that certain lines were not meant to be crossed, that restraint was validated by circumstance. For Marilyn, they deepened a familiar pattern, the sense that meaningful connection always hovered just out of reach, close enough to imagine, distant enough to hurt. The public, unaware of these subtleties, filled the silence with fantasy, speculating about secret meetings, hidden romances, untold passion restrained by decorum. But the truth was quieter and more uncomfortable. Because it did not offer romance, it offered realism. Near misses are often the result of fear aligning with convenience, of people choosing not to challenge barriers that feel both protective and inevitable. Elvis did not push to meet Marilyn because pushing meant confronting emotional unpredictability he could not control. Marilyn did not push to meet Elvis because pushing meant risking rejection in a form she could not survive. Their mutual hesitation was amplified by a culture that rewarded caution and punished vulnerability, particularly when vulnerability threatened profit. Each near encounter became another reinforcement of distance, another confirmation that silence was safer than curiosity. The line between them did not exist as a dramatic boundary drawn in defiance. It existed as a series of small decisions, none of which felt significant on their own, but together formed an unbroken pattern. A moment delayed, a suggestion ignored, a possibility dismissed, and slowly, the idea of crossing that line faded from consideration altogether. Near misses can be cruel because they preserve hope without fulfillment, but they can also be merciful because they prevent damage that cannot be undone. In the case of Elvis and Marilyn, each near miss carried the weight of what might have been, but also the protection of what did not need to happen. They were already stretched thin by expectation. Exhaustion and internal conflict, and another emotional variable, could have tipped the balance from survival into collapse. The silence between them was not maintained by a single decision or a dramatic refusal. It was maintained by momentum, by the quiet agreement between personal instinct and external control that some connections, no matter how compelling, carried too much risk. Near misses did not frustrate the system. They validated it, proving that distance could be preserved without confrontation. And so time passed. Seasons changed, careers evolved, and the near misses became history rather than opportunity. By the time either of them might have reconsidered, the context had shifted, the costs had risen, and the silence had grown heavy enough to feel permanent. Near misses are often remembered as tragedies, but in this story, they functioned as warnings, subtle signals that the line existed for a reason. Elvis and Marilyn did not stand on opposite sides of that line because they lacked courage. They stood there because courage sometimes means knowing when not to step forward. In a world that rewarded spectacle and punished humanity, their repeated almosts formed a quiet narrative of restraint, one that history rarely celebrates but often depends on. And in those near misses, the silence between two icons hardened into something unbreakable, not through force but through repetition, until crossing the line no longer felt like destiny, But like danger, fame presents itself as freedom. But for Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, it arrived wearing the shape of a cage, carefully designed, highly polished, and nearly invisible from the outside. To the public, both appeared limitless, powerful, adored beyond measure. Yet behind that illusion existed two very different systems of confinement, each restricting movement in its own way, each shaping behavior, emotion, and choice. Elvis's cage was built from discipline, loyalty, and control, reinforced by management that believed order was the only defense against collapse. Colonel Tom Parker did not merely guide Elvis's career, he governed it, structuring every appearance, every contract, every decision around predictability and profit. Elvis learned quickly that obedience was rewarded with stability, and stability felt like safety to someone who feared emotional freefall. His schedule was relentless but controlled, his environment curated, his interactions filtered, and within that structure he found a strange comfort. The cage limited his spontaneity, but it protected him from chaos, and chaos was what he feared most. Marilyn's cage was built differently, lighter in appearance but sharper in effect. Hers was constructed from image, expectation, and contradiction, a system that demanded she remain forever desirable yet never demanding, eternally youthful yet emotionally shallow, accessible yet unattainable. Studios controlled her contracts, dictated her roles, and punished her whenever she asserted independence or vulnerability. Where Elvis's cage emphasized restraint, Marilyn's enforced exposure. She was expected to give endlessly of herself, emotionally and physically, without receiving protection in return. Her instability was not merely personal. It was manufactured by an industry that refused to provide boundaries. These contrasting cages shaped how each navigated relationships and risk. Elvis, protected by control, could afford to wait, to hesitate, to step back when uncertainty appeared. Marilyn, deprived of control, felt urgency in every connection, as if time itself were working against her. Their fame placed them on parallel paths that never truly converged, because the structures around them required different behaviors to survive. Elvis survived by minimizing variables, by limiting emotional entanglement, by maintaining a composed distance that kept the system satisfied. Marilyn survived by seeking anchoring, by reaching outward for something solid enough to counterbalance the instability imposed on her. When people ask why they never crossed the line, they often underestimate the power of these systems, assuming personal desire should override institutional pressure. But desire does not exist in a vacuum. It adapts to context, and context can suffocate it quietly. For Elvis, crossing that line meant introducing unpredictability into a life carefully engineered to avoid it. For Marilyn, crossing that line meant risking vulnerability without assurance of protection. Both scenarios carried consequences neither was equipped to manage. The cages they inhabited were not simply external. They became internalized, shaping instinct, expectation, and fear. Elvis began to associate closeness with risk. Marilyn began to associate distance with abandonment, and those associations governed behavior more strongly than attraction ever could. Even if they had met in private, away from handlers and cameras, these internal cages would have followed them into the room, influencing every word, every pause, every interpretation. Silence would have emerged not as absence but as defense. Fame rewarded their compliance and punished deviation, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on staying within invisible lines. Elvis remained the polite, controlled king, Marilyn the luminous, fragile star, both performing roles written by forces larger than themselves. The tragedy is not that they were caged, but that the cages were incompatible. Elvis's cage required emotional distance to function. Marilyn's required emotional immersion to survive. There was no configuration in which both could remain intact, without one sacrificing stability. The public often imagines that love could have liberated them, but love, under those conditions, would have become another form of pressure, another expectation to fulfill, another performance to maintain. In that sense, silence was not a failure of courage. It was an adaptation, a way to exist without triggering the collapse their systems could not absorb. Same fame, different cages, moving side by side without intersection, each shaped by the rules that kept them visible and profitable. Their distance was not cold. It was structural, embedded in contracts, routines, and deeply ingrained survival strategies. History remembers their stardom as parallel legends, but beneath that symmetry lies a fundamental imbalance that made closeness unsustainable. Elvis and Marilyn did not avoid each other because they lacked feeling. They avoided each other because the cages that kept them alive would not allow it. And so the line remained uncrossed, not as a dramatic choice, but as the inevitable, outcome of two systems designed to prioritize image over humanity. Silence in this context was not emptiness. It was the only space where they could exist without breaking. People often believe that if Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe had finally met without interference, without schedules, without handlers standing quietly in the corners, something powerful would have unfolded, as if attraction alone could override fear, history, and instinct. But psychology does not work that way, and in many cases, the most intense collisions are the ones the mind avoids before they ever occur. What stood between Elvis and Marilyn was not shyness or coincidence. It was an unspoken psychological incompatibility shaped by years of survival learning. Elvis had learned to regulate himself by tightening control, by lowering emotional volume, by retreating inward when intensity threatened to overwhelm him. Marilyn had learned to regulate herself by amplifying emotion, by reaching outward, by seeking reassurance when instability appeared. These opposing responses were not choices, they were reflexes, ingrained patterns built to protect wounds that had never fully healed. In a private meeting, those reflexes would have activated immediately. Marilyn's openness, her need for affirmation, her emotional transparency would have pressed against Elvis's boundaries, not maliciously, but inevitably. Elvis's reserve, his caution, his tendency to pause rather than pursue would have registered to Marilyn as distance, perhaps even rejection, triggering the very fears that drove her intensity. Neither would have been wrong, yet neither would have been safe. Psychological attraction often forms when one person seems to hold what the other lacks, and in that sense, Elvis and Marilyn were dangerously compelling to each other. Elvis appeared stable, grounded, contained, everything Marilyn longed for. Marilyn appeared emotionally alive, expressive, vulnerable, everything Elvis kept buried. But attraction born from imbalance can quickly become destructive, because it asks one person to supply what the other cannot sustainably give. Marilyn would have needed reassurance, presence, emotional availability, a steady confirmation that she was chosen and protected. Elvis would have needed calm, predictability, emotional space, assurance that intensity would not spiral beyond control. These needs pull in opposite directions, and without conscious work and support, they create a cycle of pursuit and withdrawal that exhausts both participants. Elvis would likely have withdrawn further as Marilyn reached closer, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. Marilyn would likely have intensified her need as Elvis stepped back, not out of manipulation, but out of fear. This cycle does not require words to begin. It starts in tone, in pacing, in how quickly one responds and how slowly the other hesitates. Over time, such dynamics erode trust, reinforce insecurity, and magnify wounds rather than heal them. The tragedy is that from the outside, this pattern can look like passion, like chemistry, like something dramatic and irresistible, but from the inside it feels like constant threat. Elvis did not fear Marilyn herself. He feared losing control of himself in the presence of emotional intensity he did not know how to regulate. Marilyn did not fear Elvis himself. She feared emotional absence, the possibility that closeness would again be met with restraint rather than reassurance. Both fears were valid, both were rooted in lived experience, and neither could be reasoned away by attraction alone. Their silence, therefore, was not a lack of opportunity. It was an intuitive recognition of risk. Psychology often protects us quietly, steering us away from situations that mirror unresolved trauma, even when those situations appear desirable. Elvis's trauma taught him that emotional collapse could destroy stability. Marilyn's taught her that emotional distance could destroy self-worth. A relationship between them would have activated both fears simultaneously, creating a feedback loop of anxiety neither was equipped to break. In such circumstances, the most responsible choice is often the one that never announces itself, the choice to remain distant without explanation. People romanticize the idea of two broken souls healing each other, but healing requires capacity, timing, and safety, not just shared pain. Elvis and Marilyn shared pain, but they did not share a compatible path toward regulation and recovery. The collision that never happened was not avoided because it lacked intensity. It was avoided because it held too much of it. The mind senses when a connection threatens to reopen wounds faster than it can soothe them, and it responds with caution disguised as disinterest. This is why their story contains no dramatic rejection, no bitter words, no scandalous fallout, only absence. Absence in this case was wisdom formed through suffering. Had they crossed that line, the outcome might have been brief, intense, and damaging, leaving both more exposed and less stable than before. By not colliding, they preserved what little equilibrium they had. Silence became a form of regulation, distance a form of care. The psychological collision that never happened did not deprive the world of a great romance. It spared two fragile systems from mutual destruction. And in that restraint lies a truth that is uncomfortable but necessary, that not every powerful connection is meant to be lived, and not every attraction is meant to be explored. Some are meant to remain imagined, because imagination is safer than reality when reality carries the weight of unresolved pain. The line remained uncrossed, not because fate intervened, but because instinct prevailed, guiding two icons away from a moment that might have felt unforgettable, but would likely have been unbearable. Marilyn Monroe's life was never her own. Every step she took, every interaction she made, was observed, filtered, and evaluated by a constellation of men who believed they were protecting her, controlling her, or using her for their own purposes. Agents, studio executives, husbands, lovers, handlers, each had a vested interest in maintaining her image, while simultaneously safeguarding the investments, reputations, and egos tied to her. In this world, Elvis Presley represented something profoundly destabilizing. He was raw, unpredictable, magnetic, a man whose fame radiated power beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The very idea of him entering Marilyn's orbit threatened the fragile equilibrium carefully maintained by those around her. Men who had a stake in her career or her personal life could sense the danger instinctively. Elvis's presence, even hypothetical, introduced variables they could not control. His charisma was not merely attraction. It was influence, the kind that could disrupt schedules, priorities, and loyalties. They feared that a connection between Marilyn and Elvis would shift her attention, her emotions, and perhaps even her ambitions. And with such shifts came consequences for those who sought to manage her. The fear was practical as much as protective. Elvis's intensity was unmatched, and a man who could command adoration so completely might draw Marilyn into emotional territory that those around her were neither equipped nor willing to navigate. They acted subtly through suggestion, misdirection, timing, and circumstance, reinforcing the invisible, lines that neither Elvis nor Marilyn had to consciously acknowledge, invitations left unextended, events scheduled on different days, conversations quietly redirected, all became part of a network of unseen influence that kept the line intact. The irony is that none of it needed to be confrontational. Elvis was instinctively cautious. Marilyn was habitually seeking stability, and the men around her provided reinforcement without ever directly warning her. Their fears were projections of what they themselves would struggle to manage. But projections often carry weight, shaping behavior in subtle, sometimes irreversible ways. Marilyn sensed this tension unconsciously. There was a difference between men who nurtured her and men who managed her, and she learned to navigate both carefully. The world around her often acted preemptively, recognizing potential threats before Elvis could, and those preemptive boundaries became invisible. Barriers that felt natural to cross, or in this case to avoid. In private, Elvis's presence might have been exhilarating, even comforting, but in the context of surveillance, expectation, and management, it was destabilizing. The men around Marilyn were not villains in the conventional sense. They were functionaries of a system that treated fame as fragile and emotional exposure as liability. They acted out of self-interest, yes, but also out of an internalized belief that someone needed to maintain order, to prevent chaos, to prevent the unpredictable from tearing apart the machine that sustained Marilyn's career. And so, unspoken, unnoticed, the line between Elvis and Marilyn remained intact, enforced as much by instinct as by intervention. Their near encounters passed without drama because the invisible architecture surrounding them was strong enough to guide decisions subtly, gently, and consistently. Over time, these interventions became part of the rhythm of their lives. They never recognized the pattern. They never questioned it. And yet it ensured that distance endured. In history, we remember their fame, their allure, their mystique, but we seldom remember the quiet, indirect mechanisms that preserved their separation. It was not absence that defined this part of their story. It was protection, projection, and the careful orchestration of influence that kept two icons apart. Without drama, without confrontation, without overt interference, the line was maintained, and the silence between Elvis and Marilyn deepened, heavier, more deliberate, more permanent than any public speculation could ever understand. The men around Marilyn did not merely fear Elvis, they preserved a fragile balance that allowed both icons to survive, in their respective worlds, unbroken by the intensity of a collision. The universe, instinct, and circumstance collectively avoided. Elvis Presley carried loyalty like armor, a shield forged from the traumas and lessons of his early life, a code of conduct that demanded fidelity not only to others but to himself, to the fragile equilibrium he had spent years cultivating. Loyalty for Elvis was not merely a moral choice, it was a survival mechanism, a structure that kept his internal world intact amidst the constant onslaught of fame, expectation, and emotional volatility. He remained devoted to those he cared for, but his devotion was measured, bounded, and deliberate. It never overstepped the invisible lines that protected him from collapse. Marilyn Monroe, by contrast, lived in chaos. Not the superficial chaos of scandal or rumor, but a deeper, internal turbulence that had been accumulating since childhood. A tempest of longing, abandonment, desire, and fear that constantly demanded expression. Her emotions were immediate, expansive, and all-consuming. A force that required attention, acknowledgement, and sometimes surrender. Where Elvis moved with calculated caution, Marilyn moved with urgent intensity, seeking anchoring in a world that had rarely provided it. Their psychological rhythms were fundamentally misaligned. In theory, their attraction could have sparked brilliant chemistry. The world imagined it. Biographies speculated about it. Fans dreamed of it. But in reality, chemistry without compatibility is volatile, even destructive. Elvis's loyalty could not withstand the gravitational pull of Marilyn's chaos, and Marilyn's chaos could not find safe harbor in Elvis's careful restraint. To intersect fully would have required compromise neither was prepared to make, and the consequences of misalignment were too dangerous to ignore. The industry, too, would have compounded the risk. Elvis's handlers expected controlled behavior, consistency, and predictability. Any deviation could threaten contracts, public image, and performance schedules. Marilyn's studios demanded availability, allure, and compliance with image, leaving her little room to negotiate personal attachment. Even a private liaison carried implicit risk. The exposure of intimacy, the erosion of personal stability, the potential scandal that would reflect on both of them. Their near misses were reinforced by these systems, but their instincts did more work than circumstance. Elvis instinctively avoided emotional turbulence. Marilyn instinctively sought affirmation that might never be given. Two instincts moving in opposite directions do not meet. They orbit, they approach, they almost collide, but a gap always remains. That gap became the defining space of their relationship, or rather the lack of one. It was not indifference, it was not absence. It was recognition of incompatible survival strategies, acknowledgement that intimacy carried too high a cost. Their fame amplified this tension. Every glance, every gesture, every potential moment was magnified by the weight of celebrity. In private, a conversation might have been manageable, but in the shadow of public expectation, privacy evaporated, and emotional exposure became dangerous. Elvis could remain loyal to those within his carefully constructed boundaries, but loyalty alone could not bridge the chasm created by Marilyn's intensity. Marilyn could attempt to draw someone close, but intensity without reciprocity was destabilizing. They were each caught in the logic of their own survival. The line between them was not maintained by willpower alone. It was reinforced by instinct, circumstance, and the unyielding pressure of the worlds they inhabited. In that line, restraint was preserved, safety maintained, and the psychological equilibrium that allowed them to endure fame remained unbroken. History remembers them as icons of desire, allure, and talent, but behind that veneer lies a quieter truth. Their avoidance of each other was an act of preservation, a conscious or unconscious recognition that crossing certain boundaries could cause irreparable harm. Elvis's loyalty and Marilyn's chaos were forces of equal power, but in opposite directions. One sought stability, the other sought connection. And in the delicate architecture of survival, these forces could not converge. And so they remained apart, their silence heavy, deliberate, unbroken. A testament not to lack of feeling, but to the wisdom of restraint, the power of instinct, and the subtle, invisible mechanics of fame that govern lives far beyond the comprehension of the public eye. To the world, Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe seemed like two stars destined to collide. A narrative written before they ever entered the same room, a story the public insisted upon, filled with imagined sparks, whispered liaisons, and untold romances. Magazines speculated, fans dreamed, and Hollywood gossip thrived on the idea that proximity inevitably leads to passion. But reality, as often is the case, operated under far different rules. The public's illusion was built on observation without context. photos of smiles, brief encounters at awards, overlapping schedules, all interpreted as evidence of intimacy waiting to be realized. Yet those fragments, isolated and magnified, concealed a more complex truth. Behind every interaction existed caution, management, fear, and instinctual restraint. Neither Elvis nor Marilyn operated in a vacuum. Their every move was circumscribed by personal history, trauma, handlers, studio expectations, and the unspoken awareness of the dangers of emotional exposure. Fans imagined that attraction was sufficient to bridge distance. But attraction without alignment is perilous. They were drawn to each other by a magnetic pull, yet the forces that maintained their boundaries were stronger. Elvis's reserve, his instinct to withdraw from emotional intensity, intersected with Marilyn's constant pursuit of reassurance, creating a rhythm that prevented collision before it could begin. The world misread this silence as absence, as lack of chemistry, as missed opportunity, when in reality it was a protective mechanism. Every near encounter, every almost meeting, every fleeting alignment of presence was filtered by these invisible forces, and the line between them remained intact. Public fascination thrived on speculation, yet few understood that fame functions like a lens that distorts proximity into inevitability. A glance, a handshake, a conversation, even if it had occurred, would not have been enough to overcome the internal and external barriers that shaped their lives. Behind closed doors, both lived under constant pressure to perform, to appear unaffected, to maintain an image that obscured vulnerability. Their private reality was that intimacy carried danger, emotionally, psychologically, and professionally. And so they remained apart, not because the world dictated it, not because they lacked chemistry, but because their internal logic, shaped by past trauma, personal survival strategies, and the relentless pressures of fame, ensured that the line held. The story that the public imagined, a narrative of inevitable passion, was nothing compared to the truth of their silence. Deliberate and necessary, a rare example of two icons navigating desire, fame, and instinct without allowing their forces to destroy one another. In that silence, a private reality existed that no magazine, photograph, or rumor could capture. A careful equilibrium preserved, a dangerous closeness avoided, and the unspoken acknowledgement that some connections, no matter how tempting, are too perilous to pursue. And in that quiet, unseen space, the line remained intact, unbroken, a boundary neither scandal, speculation, nor fame could ever erase. By the time the 1960s had fully arrived, Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe had become more than entertainers. They had become cultural forces, symbols of desire, talent, and fragility magnified by fame. They had walked through the same world, orbiting the same spaces, admired by the same audiences, yet the line between them had never been crossed. That silence, preserved through instinct, circumstance, and self-protection, became their most profound legacy, a narrative as compelling as any romance could have been, because it carried depth, restraint, and a wisdom that few could comprehend. Elvis continued to perform, to record, to inspire, all while maintaining the careful boundaries he had built, honoring the lessons of his childhood, the fragility of love, and the dangers of exposure. Marilyn, luminous yet haunted, navigated fame with her own intensity, her vulnerability unmitigated by fantasy or speculation, searching for connection, craving anchoring, yet restrained by instinct, circumstance, and history. The public could never know the truth, that their non-relationship was not absence of feeling, but mastery of survival, that the line they maintained was not denial but protection, not emptiness but deliberate, hard-earned restraint. Over time, this silence became legendary, a topic of speculation, admiration, and myth-making. Biographers and fans imagined the untold passion, the secret meetings, the stolen moments. Yet what made their story enduring was not what happened, it was what did not happen. In refusing to cross the line, they preserved themselves, their careers, and a part of their humanity that fame threatened to consume. There is a rare kind of intimacy in avoidance, a recognition that closeness is not always healing, that desire unchecked can be destructive, and that two people can admire, respect, and sense one another deeply without ever touching. In that delicate balance lies the true tragedy and triumph of Elvis and Marilyn. They were closer in understanding than in presence, more connected in instinct than in reality, and more bound by silence than by scandal. Their story teaches that some lines exist not to punish, but to protect, and that survival sometimes requires the very restraint the world finds, disappointing or confusing. The images, songs, films, and photographs they left behind do not tell the full story. The full story is whispered between the lines of what could have been, in the space of quiet understanding, in the tension of near misses, in the mutual, unspoken recognition of fragility and fear. Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe never crossed the line, yet that very line elevated them into legend. Their silence is not absence. It is presence in its most subtle, disciplined, and powerful form. It is the quiet testament of two icons who understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the most profound relationships sometimes exist only in restraint, and that in preserving distance, they preserve the essence of themselves. In history, they are remembered as stars, but in truth, they are remembered as masters of survival, navigating desire, fame, and human fragility with a wisdom the world rarely sees, leaving behind a story of silence, restraint, and untold understanding that will endure far longer than any romance ever could.